Sometimes we see trouble on the horizon, and all we can think about are the consequences. But if we keep our eyes on the right thing, we realize that we had nothing to worry about at all. The author of Hebrews commends this sort of perspective to the Christian in terms of our Christian life. He says, "Let us run with endurance the race set before us, looking to Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith." Sorry, that's how I memorized it in the ESV. It's the founder and perfecter of our faith. See, we need to have the proper perspective. Now, I titled today's sermon Prequel and Sequel because those terms in movie making are all about perspective. Obviously, the original movie came first. We all know it as Star Wars, for instance. And then years and years later, a few years later, there were a couple of sequels. But then years and years later, George Lucas wrote the prequels so that we could see what came beforehand, and we can see and understand the main characters' motivations, and we get a better picture of the deeper understandings that these characters move in the main event in the original movie. See, when prequels are done well, they reveal these perspectives that give us the underlying material that we want. In a sequel, though, obviously, we recognize this, they're building on what the characters know already. In the prequel, we can rest assured that we know how it's going to turn out because we've already seen the original, right? And the prequel comes before it. So therefore, the main character in the prequel can't die, or the original wouldn't have happened, right? We know that with great assurance, but we aren't given that same assurance in the sequel, are we? There's a bit more risk for us. It's all a matter of perspective, really. If there was ever a group that needed perspective to regain that perspective, it was those who lived at the end of the first century. Now, we've said it multiple times. Domitian required everyone to make the statement, "Caesar is Lord." If you weren't willing to make that statement, which of course Christians weren't willing to do because Christians were stating quite clearly and boldly, "Jesus is Lord." If you weren't willing to make the statement, "Caesar is Lord," then you faced torture and death. And just as distracting for the church, as though that weren't enough, there were all these internal disputes over theological positions. And there were false teachers that were cropping up within the church and teaching another gospel, or teaching that you didn't have to have just Jesus, or that you needed more than just Jesus. And so those internal disputes over theology and morality, by the way, we see that in the letters to the churches in the first few chapters of this Revelation, that also was distracting their perspective. And so we can see how easy it would be to get our focus off of what we need our focus in on, Jesus, and instead be fouled up in our perspective. And I think ultimately, that's why we have Revelation. I've proposed to you that before, that Revelation is here to help us through difficult times so that we can keep the proper perspective, so that we can see who Jesus is and what God is doing throughout all of our situations. Remember what we saw at the beginning of our study in Revelation way back in January. John wrote this: "Blessed are those who take to heart these prophecies." Taking something to heart is just a matter of perspective, to correct it. If your perspective is a mile off, or even if it's just a little skewed, you need the correction. You need to get it right. And we're in Revelation chapter 14 today, which is still in the midst of this interlude after the blowing of the seventh trumpet. And it is before the first of the bowl judgments. And in this interlude, we get a whole series of flashbacks and sneak peeks to keep these movie references going. Prequels and sequels, if you will. So last week we saw how the dragon and the beast, the dragon who is Satan, the beast who is the Antichrist, and the false priest, how they come up and they have this whole plan, they have this whole agenda. The dragon gives the Antichrist the power to run the whole program, that is, the whole world. He hands it over to him. And it's all set for the glorification of a man, the Antichrist. And this man ultimately demands that everybody worship him. In fact, he and the false priest set up a whole system by which you cannot buy and sell, you cannot get food unless you worship him. And the people, in the midst of this story, exhausted from the turmoil of the tribulation, will do just that. They'll take anything. They'll grasp at anything just to have a little peace. Which is fine with the dragon, because after all, Satan just wants one thing in terms of his agenda, that God not be worshipped. Anything else will do, just don't worship God. And so if you hadn't read ahead, which I think most of us have, your perspective might falter in the midst of this. You might be wondering at this point, who is really in charge of all of this? If the judgments are so severe and life is so bad and people are flocking to this prophet, to this priest, and to the beast, well, what is God doing? Why doesn't he do something about that? Why doesn't he keep them from going there? And so we come to chapter 14, where the director of this great movie jumps forward in time again to the final scene, really, in the movie. God jumps forward to show us what he's doing. It's God's way of saying, relax. R-E-L-A-X, relax. I know what I'm doing. Stand here. Hold on to my leg. It'll be fine. Here's the correct perspective. So as we look at chapter 14 and we compare that to what we saw in chapter 13, we get all of these contrasts in terms of perspective. In chapter 13, all the focus really is on the beast and what they're doing. And in chapter 14, it's all on the lamb. We'll see that as we move through this. In chapter 13, it's all about the mark of the beast. In chapter 14 is all about those who bear the seal of God with the name of the Lamb and the Father on their foreheads. In chapter 13, we read all about this satanically controlled world. And in chapter 14, what we're going to see is this divinely ruled Mount Zion. Chapter 13, we read all about what is counterfeit and false. And in chapter 14, we're going to read all about that which is genuine and true. Big differences in perspective and focus. So let's take a look at chapter 14, picking up in verse 1. Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. John says, I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb. Now, the first time that we saw the Lamb, if you remember back in chapter 5, was in the throne room, in the midst of the throne. And in chapter 7, then there's this great multitude before the throne and the altar before the Lamb. All of that takes place in the throne room in heaven. But here, look, he's standing on Mount Zion, which is the holy city. Now, Scripture uses that term, Zion, 162 times. And almost every time that it's used, it references and refers to the physical holy city of Jerusalem, David's city. And so earthly rule is almost always in view whenever Zion is mentioned and it's discussed. So the implication that John is seeing the Lamb on Mount Zion means that the Lamb is beginning his earthly rule. That's what's inferred here. But how can that be? I mean, we haven't even had the final battle yet. How can the Lamb be on Mount Zion? That would have to be after the day of the Lord, which we haven't even gotten to yet. So how can this be if Jesus hasn't actually had that battle? Well, because again, we're not dealing with things chronologically during this whole interlude between the seventh trumpet and the first bowl. Everything is taken out of order, and we're given these vignettes so that we can see all of the surrounding factors that are happening in terms of what God is doing and why. Someone hit the scene skip button, if you remember DVD players. We used to have those things. And suddenly we've got Jesus reigning on Mount Zion. Why? Because we need a proper perspective on all of this. Our perspective should be as people marked by Christ.